The Luminous Mind. Bonus episode, School Choice with Kevin Chavous.
The real challenge we've had in America is that we have been now more focused on serving the system as opposed to having the system serve kids.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Kevin Chavous. Kevin is the founding board member and executive counsel for the American Federation for Children and the Alliance for School Choice, a noted author, a national education reform leader, and as a former member of the Council of the District of Columbia and chair of the Council of Education Committee, Mr. Chavous was at the forefront of promoting change within the district public school system. A leading national advocate for educational choice, Mr. Chavous helped to shepherd the charter school movement into the nation's capital. Under his Education Committee chairmanship, the D.C. charter school movement became the most prolific charter school jurisdiction in the country, with now nearly half of D.C.'s public school children attending charter schools. In addition, Mr. Chavous assisted in shaping the district's three-sector education partnership with the federal government. That partnership led to $60 million in annual federal dollars for D.C. public schools, public charter schools, and the first federal scholarship program, which has provided access to private schools for nearly 6,000 children from low-income families since inception. In recent years, Mr. Chavous has worked to advance charter schools and parental choice programs in a host of jurisdictions around the country, most notably in Louisiana and Tennessee. A prolific writer and much sought-after speaker, Mr. Chavous' opinion editorials have appeared in many major newspapers and has given education reform speeches in nearly every state. Former Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels says Mr. Chavous is the most effective advocate for children in America. So thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Well, it's good to be with you, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm so excited to have you on because I know this is a super busy time for you with all of the school choice rallies. You've been all over the country.
Yes. And I want to say hello to all of your listeners as well and all those folks who have a heart for our kids, because I think the beginning point for anything related to education actually is making sure that we have a heart for children.
Exactly. So I'm going to play a little bit of the devil's advocate during our discussion because I know that different questions that come up about school choice and why it is so important. I was explaining to you earlier that I'm actually from a pretty rural state. It's not very diverse like you would see in D.C., but can you give our audience some background to your experience in education, maybe starting with what your experience was in D.C., the challenges that you experienced there?
Well, you're right about one thing, Rebecca. I mean, I think that, Idaho, I'm sure, has different demographics, but I think we allow those so-called superficial differences to dictate our approach to policy making for kids when they really shouldn't. I mean, I learned when I was in D.C. and I was chair of the Education Committee and I represented a ward in Southeast D.C., which is really one of the, at the time, it was one of the crack and murder crime capitals of the country.
Wow.
And I started to visit schools and I started to visit prisons, and I found out that over 85% of our inmates were high school dropouts. We looked at the homelessness, the joblessness, the drug addiction. All the negative stuff was directly traceable to the lack of education. And so where the people were educated, you saw less of the bad stuff. Where they were uneducated, you saw more of the bad stuff. And so that led me on a mission to try to make a better linkage between, the educational offerings for our most challenged population. And that's when I embraced charter schools and school reform and eventually school choice. And what I learned also, now that I've been out of office 10 years and I travel around the country, I've learned that there's no Republican, Democrat, black, white, brown, rich, poor way to teach a kid how to read, write, and count. And I think that as I said in the beginning, we really need to make sure we go back to the basics, because at the end of the day, the challenges that a kid who has a learning disability, or it has an ineffective teacher, or has that light of education be snuffed out from them, that kid is the same in rural or urban America. And our policy and our approach to making sure we give parents what they are entitled to for their kids should be grounded in that. That, to me, is the biggest thing we need to come to grips with, that whatever differences we think we have in the eyes of these kids, we have an opportunity to give them each, no matter where they come from, what they deserve in education. That's what we should be focused on.
Exactly. So what were some of the challenges that you experienced trying to implement school choice into DC?
Well, obviously, the status quo is resistant to change. I mean, I'm finishing up my next book, and I'm talking about our need to evolve to a learning culture. We once were a learning culture back, in the early 1900s, and we decided we were going to create a system for all kids to get high school diplomas, and they skyrocketed. But then at the end of the day, what happened was we morphed into a bureaucracy and local school district system that was more focused on self-protection and preservation than educating individual children. So the real challenge that we've had in America, and the recognition started with the Nation at Risk, the landmark report in 1983. The real challenge we've had in America is that we have been now more focused on serving the system as opposed to having the system serve kids. So the beauty of having diverse options, be there, traditional public schools, charter schools, private schools, magnet schools, specialty schools, religious schools, home schools, blended schools, you just name it, all of them. The beauty of that is it really pushes the system to remembering what they should be about, and that is, providing an education for all these kids. And I think we sort of lost that along the way. And I came to that recognition as I started to work in D.C., that I saw that the more options we gave parents, not only did it benefit these kids and the parents and the families, it also, frankly, benefited the system, because the system understood that if they didn't start educating these kids right, parents would have other options to choose from.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and with those charter school options, what are some options that you named off a bunch of them, but what were some that you supported in DC? And then particularly, I don't know if many of our listeners are familiar with the DC Scholarship Program. Would you mind kind of expounding upon that and what that's done for children in that area?
Certainly. And, first, there are a host of options. A lot of people think that it's an either-or proposition, that either you're for traditional schools or you're for charters, you're for home schools, you're for private schools. And I don't think it's an either-or proposition. If you're a parent now with more than one child, there's no question that those two kids aren't alike, or those three kids aren't alike, or those four kids. And, kids today, particularly in this new age technology environment we're living in, they respond to different learning modalities. So what works for little Johnny may not work for little Jane. And for us to have nothing but a cookie cutter approach where, based on zip code and accident of birth, all Johnny, Jane, and Jimmy all have to go to the same school and the same teacher and learn at the same pace, it doesn't make sense. And I give the example in speech. It's like, I took algebra in the 9th grade. I probably, in my math situation, should have taken it in 10th grade, but there's no way I could have done that. But there are some kids that are ready for algebra in the 7th grade. And there should be nothing wrong with us having educational offerings available to meet kids where they are, as opposed to forcing them to meet the system where the system is. And that's the big challenge. And so in DC, I learned this. And when people came to me, like the folks who wanted to start the Seed Charter School, 150 boys, 150 girls on a college-like campus, residential school, first charter residential school in the country. And most of them came from urban environments where there was dysfunction. And they came from schools where 90% of the kids were failing. We're now 10 years later, 15 years later, 90% of those kids are graduating, going to college. Oprah bought them all furniture at the school and all that. So, I mean, the C school is a good example where it was an option that otherwise didn't exist for kids who came from a challenged background who could have been lost in the system. And there was a host of others. I mean, Bill Marriott is from D.C. He and the hotel restaurant folks came to me. They wanted to do a hospitality high school, especially high school for kids who wanted to go into hotel restaurant management, marketing, and even become chefs. And, you know, one of the chefs now has a show on one of the graduates on the cooking channel, food channel, I think. So, you know, we had, you know, math and science, we had Chinese immersion, all these different options. But what I found in early 2000s that our charter school movement, which is now nearly half of our public school kids in DC are in charter schools, and their test scores are about 20 points higher across the board than DC public schools. But we found that in the early 2000s that we had waiting lists going into the thousands for these schools.
Yeah. So, that's a norm. I mean, that's a common thing. The lottery process the lottery process would break your heart, and we have 1 million kids waiting for charter schools now, and waiting lists. The C school, actually, the school I was referring to, I actually pulled the lottery for the first year, and it broke my heart because half the room was there, you know. Well, actually, 80% of the room was sad that I didn't pull their kids. And I at first I thought it'd be a good thing, and I realized there were only just a handful of slots. And they showed the seed school in Waiting for Superman. That was the lottery school that they showed in my ward. I stopped pulling after the first year because there was no way I could handle that. But even watching the film was I was crying for these children.
It just broke my, you know, and not to belabor it, but what really got to me is this senior citizen. She was about 80 years old, and she gave me her lucky $50 in 1925 and said, "Hold on to this when you pull it." And so you pull my grandkid's name, and I did not pull it, and I said, "Wow, this is too much for me." But it shouldn't be like that. And I realized when we had thousands of kids on our waiting list in 2003, I think, Secretary Page sat down with Secretary Rod Page, who was Secretary of Education under President George W. Bush, rather. He and President Bush sat down with me and Mayor Tony Williams of D.C., and they said they wanted to do this voucher program, a scholarship program, so that low-income kids could go to private schools, and it'd be a landmark federal program. And I said, well, that would be fine, but let's lift all boats, because if we're going to have a federal partnership with D.C., one of its kind, first of its kind, let's make sure you give the same amount of money to D.C. public schools and D.C. public charter schools. And they did that. So we had this 3-sector strategy where D.C. public schools, D.C. public charter schools got money, and then we had, you know, the same amount of money available for scholarships. And now, 10 years later, we've had over 6,000 kids, as you mentioned in the beginning, go through this program. 90% of them graduating from high school, 90% of them going to college. And some of them go to schools as fancy as Sidwell Friends, where the president's kids go, or some of the more exclusive Jesuit schools. And their lives have changed. And so I think that when people always ask me, what are the best options? I say the best options are first making sure there are options for parents, and then let parents be educated consumers. And one other thing I want to say, Rebecca, is that the fastest growing form of school choice is the homeschool environment. And every time, you know, people say to me, well, you know, what's with this homeschool thing? I said, well, you know, the answer lies in the question. The reason why it's growing is because people are sick and tired of the status quo not taking care of their kids.
Yeah.
And, you know, and look, homeschooling is a great option. I just think we've got to pull ourselves back from sort of this protective, you know, provincial view of education that one system is preferable over the other. Because at the end of the day, it's not what's best for kids who respond to different approaches. We need to make sure we give them as many as possible.
Exactly. Now, I was under the impression that scholarship program actually only takes half of the money that the DC public schools get. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When it started, it was equal. But it's funny that over the last 10 years, now DC public schools gets nearly twice as much. and they still haven't been able to do a full accounting for what they use it for. I mean, that's largely because bureaucracies can't, it's hard for them to say what they, they may use it for the assistant to the deputy to the assistant or something, I don't know. And the members of Congress have been trying to get an idea of, what are you using this, 15, 20, 30, $40 million for specifically? And that's okay. I mean, that's just how bureaucracies work. But the beauty about the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program is, that 15 to 20 million they get every year, we know it's going to go for individual scholarships for kids who come from failing schools to go to schools that work for them. And that's a beautiful thing, where it's a direct linkage between the money that's given and, it going to schools that serve the kids' needs.
Well, and that's what I think's the most interesting about, I've seen different documentaries with Michelle Rhee, and she was in the DC public charter school arena. Was she there when you were there as chairman, or was that later?
I know Michelle well. Adrian Fenty, who was the mayor who hired her, I had conversations with Michelle during that process. And Adrian Fenty worked on my staff when I was on the city council. He was my education committee clerk. And then I think they actually got together through Joel Klein. But during that whole process, Michelle and I were talking quite a bit. So I know her really well, and I know Adrian and Joel Klein well. And she got a lot of heat for what she was doing.
Yeah, she did.
But what I tell people, I mean, one of the things that I said to, Adrian Fenty and Michelle is, I think that, people, we need this change in education. We need people to be more kid-centered and to provide these options. But we also have to understand that there's a certain nostalgia and sentimentality attached to the neighborhood school that worked well 20 years ago that may not be working now. There's a certain nostalgia and sentimentality attached to the local school district that's oftentimes the largest employer.
Yeah.
And so I think that,
we have that problem here too, though.
Yeah. So, I mean, when they employ half the people in town or whatever, or 30 or 40%, then, you're talking about people's jobs, which shouldn't be most important in terms of kids' education. But I understand the tie and the link. So part of it is we got to hug people while we change them. So it's one thing to take a battering ram and say, do it this way because I say it's best. It's another way to show them that, and to be able to demonstrate for them how you excite the possibilities.
Yeah. And I think that's what your scholarship program does, is it shows that maybe money isn't really the problem. The lack of money isn't the problem.
I mean, one thing I do is we have these various scholarship programs around the country, and we would bring legislators in from different states who are considering school choice bills. And I can't tell you how many times we had a group of, rural white Republican legislators from like Tennessee, or some African-American legislators from New Orleans or Baton Rouge go to a choice school, a scholarship school in Florida or Milwaukee or DC, where we have successful programs. And literally their mouths are open. And they say things like, wow, I didn't know education could be like this in elementary school. Or I never seen kids so excited about going to school. And when you hear teachers in these schools talk about, they can't even imagine having a quote unquote attendance problem, because kids get there early because they want to be there. When we excite the possibilities of what education can be, and how motivating and how much fun it could be, and how transformative it could be, it's a whole different discussion than, what people think they know. I mean, the biggest problem with all of this is people don't know what they know, and they don't know what they don't know. When you present to them the future and show the future in a way that makes sense for them in terms of education, is a beautiful thing to see. And I think that if we can, I use this expression, Rebecca, divorce ourselves from ourselves in terms of just, this historical thinking, and say, we're going to free our minds and be open to the possibilities of what education can be like. It's really a beautiful thing.
tradition sometimes can be hampering. Like I've discussed on other shows that, some of the experiences that I've had is some of these people that have been in the system for 30 years, that's what they know. And so I love what you're saying is that sometimes we have to look at those possibilities. And how has that school choice option, I mean, we kind of touched on it, how has it affected the inner city family in D.C.?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think many of us, most of us, hopefully all of us, are God-fearing, and there's a certain spirituality attached to just our existence as human beings. And the old biblical expression, and a child shall lead them. I think that we have seen that in D.C., we've seen it in Milwaukee, we've seen it in Louisiana, where because the kids were so excited and transformed by being in good schools, it changes the dynamic in the family. We started a scholarship program in Louisiana that I worked with Governor Jindal and as well as members of the Black Caucus in that state to get going. And a year and a half or so after the program got going, they had a reception for several of the legislators who supported it. And these 20 African-American public housing single mothers, they put the program together. Half of them could not read. Many of them had dropped out of high school. And most of them had never spoken before a crowd before. And they all spoke, all 20 of them, and talked about how seeing their kids, who may be as young as 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, going to a school that worked for them, how it changed their lives. And several of those women had even gone back to sign up for their GED because they saw how exciting education had become for their kids. So when you talk about a transformation, it's like one bad apple can spoil a bunch. Well, guess what? If you have a positive spark in the family structure that looks at education differently, is excited about it, even if that spark is a first or second grader who's excited about school and all of that, it can change the whole family. And I think that's good for America.
Yeah, that changes the trajectory of everyone's life, it sounds like. So we hear a lot in public policy that, we need to pool the money so we have a greater benefit. But you're saying that, with what you've seen, diversity in education is very important. And why is that? Why is that diversity? Why put money in so many different places instead of pooling it together?
Well, it's like right now. Is everyone going to buy an iPhone? Well, Samsung says no. Is everyone going to go to the Safeway or, with all due respect, the Albertsons? The answer is no. I mean, right now, if you go to a buffet line, will everyone have the chicken fried steak? Well, no. Society today is all about choice, and it's all about having diverse options. The PDA, the personal computer, the handheld, the texting, all that stuff, even the designs, the covers you put on it, the wallpaper, the screensaver, everything is unique for the individual. And we've got to be respectful of that and understand that in this new society, things are ever changing. And, one other thing I want to make sure your listeners understand, Rebecca, and this isn't a knock on the traditional education, because there are some amazing teachers who've done amazing work for kids for 20, 30 years, but those who do it the same way and they think that they're preparing kids for the future, they're a little bit wrong. I mean, a good friend of mine works at Google, and he's a Google education evangelist, and he told me something that just blew me away. Right now, the average 5-year-old will work in a job that doesn't exist today. So think about that. That means that all the notions of school to career that we grew up with, that we even try to implement with today's kids, they're outdated.
Yeah.
Because jobs of tomorrow for a 5-year-old, they aren't even in existence. So we need these choices. We need these diverse offerings so that people get as well-rounded and expansive exposure as possible to all aspects of an educational experience to prepare them for tomorrow.
Yeah. So before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors.
Hey, fire starters, this is Mark, producer of The Luminous Mind. If you're like me, the thought of going out to the store and shopping is enough to make you want to crawl in a hole and hide. If that's you, then do your shopping online through Amazon. Just go to theluminousmind.net, click on the Amazon link, and shop away. Also, most of the books and resources that Rebecca and her guests discuss can be found on our Amazon links as well. Again, if you're like me, you have already accidentally signed up for Amazon Prime, so most of those purchases should have free shipping as well. Good luck!
Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Kevin Chavous, the National School Choice Advocate. Do you feel like the small public charter schools, the magnet schools, all these places, when we divide up the money, we have a better idea of the results we get? I mean, you talked about the DC public school and how they get millions of dollars that are unaccountable, but it's probably, like you talked about, the bureaucracy. You know, when you have a great big boat, it's hard to see, where everything's at. Versus some of the small schools, it's easier accountability. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think so. I think that there are no real absolutes in terms of this. I think that folks want to put things in a nice, clean box, like it's this way or that way. And oftentimes it's like that great question of maybe. I really think that we should not be, as Einstein used to talk about, not so consumed with all of the answers, but really focus on the questions. And I think that too often in education policy discussion, we say, all right, this is the way to go, and we're going to study it, and we're going to, plan the plan, debate the debate. And then, after 5 years, say this is the way to go. Well, there's no real silver bullet. Everyone is looking for the silver bullet in education. What system is the best system? What approach is the best approach? Large school, large class size, small class size, all this stuff. And I think that it really does depend. I think that some kids are going to thrive in certain environments, and some won't. So the worst thing we can do is, I think we need baseline standards. I don't want to make it sound like it's just, willy-nilly out there. And you have to meet these basic standards in your state. You have to make sure that, you're in compliance with federal and local regulatory laws and all of that. But at the end of the day, we need to be a little more open to presenting things in a way that kids can learn from. Let me give you one quick example in the sciences. And studies are beginning to bear this out. It used to be in biology and chemistry that, folks would, read all this stuff and kids, would take the test and they'd have a few lab assignments and that, worked okay. But more and more sciences, and we had this big issue in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. More and more of these STEM folks are finding that experiential learning is really working for these kids. It's getting them interested in science. So your biology class, is opposed to sitting there with a textbook for an hour a day, they may actually go to the aquatic gardens and they may actually pull a few plants up and then have that experience sort of guide their understanding that is better than book knowledge. So I do think that we just have to be a little more open and understand that if we want to connect kids to their interests, that we have to be open in the way we share information with them.
So are you thinking that giving teachers more flexibility and autonomy to teach the styles that they want? And we talked about keeping in line with government, standards and stuff, but do you see that flexibility that teachers can have as being a positive resource?
I do. I think teachers need flexibility. Now, I do think that, but the other thing teachers need, which they don't get enough of, is more professional development, more peer-to-peer review. Every good school that I have visited, each and every one, has some measure of peer-to-peer review and, sharing of information, actual other teachers, more senior teachers reviewing their classrooms and offering suggestions, more professional development. So, I think that this idea of once a teacher reaches a certain level, then you just let them go out on their own, untethered. I don't think that works. I think we all need in every profession. I'm a lawyer by training. Lawyers, doctors, dentists, counsel. We all have professional development requirements. To keep. And I think that we need to look at teachers as a profession. We need to professionalize the teaching corps, and I think that peer review aspect of it, and not just in terms of criticizing, but making sure they're up to date with how to manage a whiteboard, or so the computers aren't in the closet, on how to embrace aspects of experiential learning in their classroom assignment, even when it comes to math. I think that makes a big difference. But once they have that, creative approaches really matter. One quick thing, Rebecca, I visited a school and got to know the entertainer Pitbull. He worked with a friend of mine, Fernando Zulueta, who is a Cuban guy who runs Academica. They have one of the best charter schools in the country, 100 schools in South Florida and various places around the country. And Pitbull, the entertainer, and Fern, they started the SLAM Academy, which is sports and leadership and management, and it has a sports-themed approach. Well, the teacher who teaches math to some junior high, I think 7th grade math, she set up her whole classroom with the various dimensions as in a sports themed way to help kids relate to math. So she has the part of the football field designed so that they can measure yards and feet. They've got used the soccer field dimensions. They have fantasy football with Miami Dolphins players, and every lesson that she teaches them has this sports theme attached to it. And even the algebraic problem she gives them, she blends it in a way so that the kids, they can connect with it based on their knowledge of sports. And it's pretty amazing. I sat in her classroom and I was actually blown away by how interested many of these inner city black and brown kids were to learn math in this way. I'd never been in a class like that. Now, and the kids have shown gradual and marked and noticeable increase on their math scores. So that's an example of someone, she's a young teacher. She's got some people who've been, some superior teachers, more senior teachers who've been monitoring her work and sitting in her classroom. But she's stumbled on something that is resonating with these kids, and it would have never happened if she had to follow the traditional approach.
Yeah. Well, I love how you talked about professional development, because you do see that in every other profession. And it does make sense that if we're teaching children, for jobs that don't even exist right now, to always be developing that. And so I like how you talked about that professional development. Do you feel like teachers, you talked about some of the flexibility that they get. Do you feel like teacher tenure is really important? Obviously, teachers who have experience, they come with that experience, but you talked about this young teacher. How do you think teacher tenure fits within our education system?
Well, I don't think that there should be automatic tenure for life. In California, for example, if you spend 2 years as a teacher, then you have a job for life, and they virtually have no reviews, and it's hard to get fired. They even had a hard time getting a bill passed in the California legislature that made it easier to fire teachers who were guilty of molesting kids. So this whole tenure thing is crazy, because the union's view is, most traditional unions is, that the process is real important, and we want to protect teachers' rights. Well, I think that we've gone overboard with that, and I think that we should consider things like performance pay. And I know those are volatile issues, but Randy Weingarten, who is head of the American Federation for Teachers, and she and I had a debate at Stanford University a year and a half ago. And she was talking about we don't need charter schools, we need to protect tenure and all that. And I said, look, well, let me tell you, when A Nation at Risk came out, Randy, in 1983, they came out with, they said that the threat of, our biggest threat is not a military threat, but the biggest threat to our democracy was our failure to educate these kids across the board. And the other countries are surpassing us. Well, now, 30 years later, we're in the 20s by most independent yardsticks.
Yeah, we're falling.
We're falling, but when that report came out, A Nation at Risk, they listed 38 recommendations, and we haven't adopted hardly any of them. Virtually none have been adopted because of the politics. But one of the recommendations, they had a whole section on teaching and learning, and recommendations for teachers. And I said this to Randy Weingarten, head of the union. I said, Randy, one of the recommendations they came out with in A Nation at Risk was professionalizing our teaching corps. That's something you could do. And she agrees, so that's something that, we should do. I said, well, why don't you do that? Because if you professionalize your teaching corps, then the way to deal with the tenure issue, the way to deal with bad teachers is through self-policing. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I know that if I violate certain canons of ethics and I go before my own peer review, I can be disbarred.
Yeah.
And with medical doctors who can lose their license. So as opposed to saying that, okay, the system is going to get rid of bad teachers and fight over whether or not that's possible, why don't you professionalize your teaching corps, pay them higher salaries, put in place certain peer review, self-policing measures so that when you have teachers who aren't doing the job, then you get rid of them. You take away their license. I think that part of it is that we all need to look at doing things a little differently. If we want teachers to get the respect they deserve, let's make them professionals. But being a professional means you're going to be held to a standard where inside your own industry, we can throw you out if you don't do the job. And by the same token, we can make master teachers. We can pay them more. We can, and then we can make sure that in these low-income communities, either rural or urban, where we know most of them have had bad teachers, then we can pepper them with quality teachers that will dramatically improve their outputs.
I've always been kind of surprised that unions protect such horrible things like child molestation and stuff like that, because I think that tends to make them not very valid. Well,
and I think that it goes back to what I said earlier. I think that we've evolved, or I might say devolved, to the place where we're protecting the system and the structure more than we are
the children.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest things we face.
Yeah. Well, and I saw in a documentary in New York where, they are paying teachers millions of dollars that are unfit to be in classrooms to basically go to rubber rooms. That's good money that could be going back into the school, but it's so hard to fire, some of these teachers that are, like I said, they are unfit because of some of their past experiences that they've had in the classroom.
I've seen rubber rooms, and we've got folks there who
and they're getting a paycheck.
They're getting a paycheck, and these rubber rooms, you've got about 3,000 teachers there who have been deemed to be unfit to be around kids, and they get a paycheck, and they get step increases, and it takes an average of 5 years to get them off the payroll.
Wow. Well, let's kind of go back to parents and why they're so important in the school choice movement. Like we talked about watching some of those lottery videos, I think one of the things that I've heard when I've worked in public policy is that parents really don't have the education, especially in the inner city. Sadly, they've dubbed some of the parents that, single family and drug abuse and all this stuff, that they don't have the education to know what's best for their children. What would you say to those people?
Well, I say that's absolutely not true. All parents want what's best for their kids, and no one loves a child more than their parent. Now, of course, there are those aberrant examples where, certain parents may have been caught up in a situation where it doesn't serve their kids well. But by and large, just because you're low income, poor, and live in public housing, it doesn't mean you don't care. That's an insulting conclusion. And I think the other thing is that our default position should always be to trust the parents' judgment about what works for their kids. And we recognize that some parents and some households may be challenged because there are generations of folks who didn't get the education. And we've seen it 2 or 3 generations of folks who dropped out of school and maybe couldn't read or write. So one of the things we do with our scholarship programs, we did in Louisiana, we did in Milwaukee, in D.C., Florida, is we work with parent groups like the Black Alliance for Educational Options and others who put on training programs for parents on how to be an advocate for your child, how to pick the right school for your child, those kinds of things. And it's
learning styles and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's really amazing, though, to see how people stand straighter when they feel empowered. And we have seen in these programs, like I talked about those mothers in New Orleans, and other situations, that when parents are empowered with making decisions for their kids, they take those decisions seriously. We should not create a dynamic where a government system is making choices for parents. I mean, if we start with education in schools, then it's like where you live, is where you work, is where you go. I mean, that's not what democracy is all about. Democracy is all about the good of the whole, but the freedom of the individual is at the core, and the freedom of choice. And so, part of what we need to make sure we do is not just default back to those parents don't know what's best for their kids, but the default is these parents care about these kids, which they do. They know what's best for their kids, and if they don't have the tools to understand and figure out which school may work, then guess what? Then we should be able to provide them some guidance on that, and then still let them make choices for their kids to work.
Well, and from what I've seen, from my own personal perspective, is that once parents realize they have a choice, the apathy goes away and they become very driven to find the best choice regardless of their education. Because like you said, I mean, even parents that are living in government housing, they want a better life for their children. Do you agree with that? Yeah,
we see it all the time. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, these parents are, once they're empowered, they want a better life for their kids. But see, the problem is that the cycle of poverty is a cycle of hopelessness and despair. And what we've allowed to happen is we haven't given folks hope. And hope is not just a platitude or a speech, but hope can be seen in the future of one's kids. And when you actually know that this kid is going to get something that you didn't get in school and they have a future, I mean, it changes everything. And I think that's what we have to continue to remember, that part of the reason why parents haven't been as responsive in some of these low-income and disaffected communities, we've given them no reason. We've given them no option. That all they know is what we've allowed to happen. But when we change that, it really does like turn on a light switch.
Yeah, and some of the schools that they have, they're almost sentences for a horrible life for their children. I mean, some of them, like you said, end up in jail because they're poorly educated. So
absolutely, and the school to prison pipeline is intense. I mean, we know that, as I said, 82% of all Americans' inmate population are high school dropouts. So there's no question. And we have, I think, nearly 2,500 what we call dropout factories. And these are 2,500 schools in America right now. We know that, 80+% of the kids are going to drop out and go to prison. We know.
Wow. That's crazy. So I have heard that the school choice movement is the new civil rights movement. What would you say about that? Do you agree with that, or?
Well, absolutely. There are some clear similarities. And remember, the civil rights movement that was led in the 60s by Dr. Martin Luther King and others, it got its legs through education. It started with Brown versus Board of Education, the fact that African Americans were going to separate and unequal schools. And so that led to the fight for public accommodations and housing and voting rights and all of that. But it is clear that today that the new civil rights struggle is a struggle to make sure that each and every child has equal access to a high-quality education. And we know that doesn't happen. I mean, I've looked at the state.
Well, and a poor education is just another way to keep the disadvantaged and the minorities down. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and we see it. And the linkage between, poor white America and the poor Americans of color is clear. That, folks tend to try to say that this is a low-income urban problem, when really it's an American problem. if you look at the McKinsey report, did an economic study of the achievement gap, and they didn't look at just the achievement gap of black and brown folks compared to white kids. They looked at the achievement gap between all low-income Americans and their counterparts in this country who are middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy. And it's staggering. Millions and millions of dollars are lost each year because we have failed to close that gap. Now the gap between the rich and the poor has grown. The key about the civil rights movement today in education is that we want to make sure that every American, irrespective of color, who irrespective of socioeconomic status or where you live, you have access to a high-quality education. Our failure to do that is having a disastrous impact on our future. And, there's an interesting statistic that I heard and verified that 30 years ago, we were the most socially mobile country on the planet, which meant that more than any other country, through hard work and through education, you could pull yourself up from your own bootstraps and go from poverty to the wealthy class, more than any other country. Today, America is the least socially mobile country in the world. So that means if you are born in America poor, whether you're black or white, you're in rural Appalachia, or if you're in the hood in Chicago, you have a 95% chance of staying in poverty your whole life.
Wow. So
that means, if you think about it, some low-income Asian guy in China who's riding a rickshaw around Hong Kong has a better chance of entering their wealthy class than some rural kid in Appalachia or in Idaho or some urban dweller in East Palo Alto or in Southeast D.C. And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. And the reason why that these folks in these other countries are able to extricate themselves out of poverty better than we are, when we used to be number one at, is education. And so that's what makes it the civil rights issue, that it is a fundamental civil right for all of our Americans to be able to have access to a quality education. And our failure to do that is creating a permanent underclass that is bigger than any other place in the world.
Yeah. I actually read an article last night that was talking about how most of the middle class parents in China are kind of fed up with their education system, and they're actually turning to Montessori schools and ward-off schools and some of those alternative educations, even homeschooling, which I thought was interesting. And so they're even seeing that education is an important thing to have for your own destiny. So this might sound like a funny question because of what you're already doing, but if you could leave a legacy, what would it be?
Oh, wow. Well, I tell you what would be an amazing legacy is that we wake up one day and instead of talking about test scores or standards, we're talking about, and instead of wondering about how many cures of cancer have been trapped inside the mind of a child we failed to educate, instead of talking about those things, instead of talking about the negativity associated with education, failing schools, achievement gap, and what we're not doing. It would be an amazing legacy to do a pivot where we actually excite the possibilities around learning, where we talk about a learning culture, where people get jazzed up about friendly competitions between cities and towns on not just the science fair for sixth graders, but we erect statues to people who go back and get their GED, where there's a whole culture built around this notion of folks who are excited about learning, and it becomes commonplace. And that even folks as diverse and varied as presidents, kings, or the Kardashians tweet about what they learned in certain classes. I think that a legacy, not just for me, but a legacy that I think makes sense for America to give to this next generation is recreate a culture that is excited about education and learning. And the thirst for knowledge is something that we don't necessarily just chase randomly, but we embrace wholeheartedly.
I love that you said that. I one of the things I failed to mention is Kevin is an NCAA All-American basketball player, so I think it'd be cool if we could turn kids that are that think their only way out is with basketball is actually with education.
Yeah, well, the older I get,
awesome.
the better I was, so thanks for mentioning that.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So before we say goodbye, I feel bad. I've got a full hour with you. This is awesome. Before we say goodbye, is there any parting final words that you have for parents? And then also give us your contact information, how we can go ahead and get in touch with you and get some of your books.
Well, I tell you what, you can. My website is kevinpchavous.com. That's kevinpchavous.com. Or you can also look at federationforchildren.org. That's the contact information, and you learn a lot about my work. I tell you, I want people to be hopeful and to be positive about the future. And the only way we can do that is for them to embrace this idea of bettering oneself day to day. The will to do better and be better is the buzzword for the future. And we can get that by embracing learning, and that's what America needs to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time and for joining us. I really have enjoyed listening to your play. I did notice, too, that as we talked, I had some negative obstacle questions, but you were so positive that I'm like, I want to keep it positive.
Well, thanks so much, Rebecca. Good luck to you and your folks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Kevin Chavous and his work with the National School Choice Movement, be sure to go to our website, theluminousmind.net. Please, when you're there, let us know what you think of our podcast. Also, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content by subscribing to iTunes as well as YouTube. Be sure to help us continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.